Good morning, everybody. My name is Jo Chandler and I'm from the Centre for Advancing Journalism at the University of Melbourne, and I'll be your moderator for this session. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge elders past and present of the Wurundjeri people, who are the custodians of the land on which I work and live. I also acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which you are and our university campuses are situated. These lands being the place of age-old ceremonies of celebration, initiation, renewal, and that the local Aboriginal peoples have had and continue to have a unique role in the life of these lands. To start this session, I'd like to introduce Rose Hiscock, Director of Museums and Collections here at the University of Melbourne, who will give a short presentation on the arts and framing of our climate future before we start talking about climate resilience.
Thank you, Jo, and hello, colleagues. I'm delighted to have a moment to talk to you about museums and collections across the University of Melbourne and the way that our museums, galleries, collections, and our engagement with young adults can help this conversation, this really important conversation that we're having together. So I'm going to ask my colleague to share a slide deck, and I'm going to talk you through some of the behind the scenes of our museums and collections, and then two very short videos that talk to how we engage through museums and collections. So to the first slide, let me also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're on. Next slide, please. And I'm on Wurundjeri land, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. To the next slide, we have at this university, the University of Melbourne, 40 different collections. And I want to talk for a moment about the role that a collection can play in telling a story around climate change. We've listed those collections there, based in both faculty and centrally. But if we thought about our collection and the story it could help us tell for climate change, we have a herbarium collection, we have a geology collection, we have a contemporary art collection, we have an incredibly significant First Nations collection, we have collections in computer science, and on it goes. As you put those collections together and start thinking about, well, what is a story that we could tell around climate change by looking at our collection, we start to weave a really interesting narrative, and one that can only be told through this university because of its very unique collections. We're doing a lot of work at the moment. You may have heard of it. It's called the Cultural Commons. It's a program of work across our university where we're looking at our museums, galleries and collections in a new way and starting to address some of the great challenges of our time by drawing on our collections. Now, the other way that we work in the Museums and Collections Department is through exhibitions, events and programs. And I'd like to focus here on Science Gallery Melbourne, which is about to open in Melbourne Connect, and to talk through some of the programs that we've been doing and the ways in which we're able to tell stories through our museums and galleries and the ways in which we engage with audiences. So to the next slide, please. Science Gallery is about to open as part of the Melbourne Connect precinct, which we've just had the building handover. So this is the former Women's Hospital site on the corner of Grattan and Swanson Street. You can see the gallery there on the corner itself. Science Gallery is part of an international network of galleries that's around the world, all embedded into leading universities. We have 8 around the world in London, Detroit, Venice, Dublin, Atlanta, Rotterdam, and we've just announced a new gallery in Berlin. Next slide, please. The way that the gallery works is that we work with young adults, so 15 to 25-year-olds, and we also work with experts. We on a think tank basis, and we ask young people, we ask experts, what are the big challenges that we should be addressing through our museums and galleries? And for those of you who work in or know much about the cultural sector, it's a very different way of working. It's absolutely ground up. It's absolutely about asking young people what matters, and therefore what exhibitions do we develop, instead of it being a top-down approach. And as a result of that, we tend to follow global currents. We follow movements around the world of what is mattering to young people. And of course, climate change, sustainability are very high on the list. Next slide, please. The gallery itself will also include a Centre for STEM Excellence, which will be a learning program in partnership with the Department of Education, where we'll be working with a catchment of schools in Melbourne and also the northern suburbs, low SES schools, where we're working with those about 25 schools in a very embedded way across the life of each of their students, where we'll be embedding programs and ideas, design thinking based into our exhibitions. Next slide, please. Science Gallery opens, the building's just been handed over, but when we open in June. And I wanted just to show these 3 topics of our future exhibitions. So looking at mental health and wellbeing from the perspectives of young people. Swarm, looking at collective intelligence, behavioural movements, population dynamics, robotics. So we're looking at groupthink, pandemics. You can see how we fit within global trends, and dark matter, which is part of an ARC Centre of Excellence. These themes all come from conversations with young people, and as I mentioned, sustainability, resilience, and climate change has been a part of the conversations that we've had over many years with our young people. And it's actually embedded in each of those themes. But last year as well, the year before last, I've lost the COVID year, in 2019, we ran a program called Disposable. And it had at its heart sustainability. And I want to show 2 video clips. They're both very short, that are video works that came out of that program. And it'll give you a sense of how we work with our young people and the kinds of exhibitions and programs that we develop as a result of it. And through that, I'm hoping that you'll see the reach that we can have in the community, the reach that museums and galleries can have through clever programming. So if I could ask you to play the 2 videos, please.
My name's Mitch Marnie. I'm a young Bunurong artist. I'm the artist in residence for Science Gallery. As part of my residency, I'm building an 11-metre eel trap as part of the disposable pop-up gallery, all out of river reeds and biodegradable materials.
My name's Luke West. I'm a Palo man from Tasmania, and I'm lucky enough to have a job as a mediator with Science Gallery. So the site where the Gunditjmara people live, which is called Budgebim, recently got recognised as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And that makes it the first World Heritage Site to be recognised purely for its Indigenous value.
So the whole idea behind the work is thinking about how we deal with our waste in Australia and thinking about Indigenous attitudes towards waste and sustainable living. Auntie Marie, she's my great auntie, and we've been working together pretty well full-time this year on all different kinds of projects. It was actually her who put the whole project on the table in front of me one afternoon and said, would you like to do that? We could do it together.
I think working on a 10-metre river reed eel trap, which I've never done before and nor has Mitch, to bring that together at Footscray Community Arts Centre. As you can see, there's been huge amounts of community coming in and being part of the whole process, which is fantastic.
We've had everyone from 4 or 5-year-olds to adults, people who are working on their own artworks and have time off come to volunteer. We're using the eel trap as a key technology used by a lot of Indigenous people as a sustainable fishing practice.
It will degrade, it will wash down, it will flow out to all the places it needs to connect with. These plants are also the filters, and it's like the lifeblood of the Eastern Kulin nation that flows through this beautiful part of our country.
This installation is called Pollution Pods, and it's a series of 5 geodesic domes. And within these domes, I've recreated the atmospheres of 5 different places in the world. You might walk into London, for instance, and think it's not that bad, but if you hang around in there for 20 minutes, it gets worse and worse and worse. But I'm certainly interested in the crossover between art and science and how both disciplines can make people think about the lives they lead and how they can change them to be more ecological and more sympathetic to the earth that we live on.
So in closing, I think that gives you a good sense of the kinds of projects that we do through Science Gallery and the power for museums, galleries, collections and programs to engage in ways that really change boundaries and changes our ways of thinking. I'll close simply by saying this is our new space behind me, which is under wraps at the moment and will be opening in June. And we very much look forward to working with our colleagues across the university to bring other programs to life. So with that, I'll close and hand back to Jo. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rose, and welcome back, everyone. So just to set the scene a little, resilience is a really big word. It's a big aspiration. And I guess what we're trying to think about in this session is what it means in the context of our climate present and our climate future. For any of us who are parents or teachers, it's something that we likely think about a lot. We want to nurture resilience in our kids. We want to equip them to overcome whatever sorts of adversities or setbacks that they encounter and pick themselves up and plough on. If we're engineers or builders, we think of resilience in terms of highways and high-rises and houses. We want those systems to remain operational, even as all kinds of variables test them. When we bring the word resilience into a discussion around climate change, we're talking about all the iterations of that word, thinking about our human capacities to respond to a profoundly and even a violently changed world. Today, we've brought together a panel with a wide range of credentials and expertise and insights to contemplate that word, resilience, and what it means in their work and in the context of climate change. And hopefully this conversation will allow our audience some insights into the power and the limitations of human resilience when we find ourselves in an unfamiliar and not so friendly planet. Just a reminder that this session is going to be recorded. Please place, if we welcome questions from the audience, but if you could place them in the Q&A function, and our team of moderators will send them through to me. We will endeavour to get through as many as we can. The chat function is also activated, so if you could share your thoughts with other attendees, but just be mindful that that chat function is visible to everyone, so please moderate accordingly and behave nicely. If you would like to live tweet today's session, absolutely please do, and the hashtag is #UniMelb Climate Futures, all one word. So now I'd like to introduce our speakers. Professor Lisa Gibbs is the Director of the Child and Community Wellbeing Program, the Centre for Health and Equity, and Lead of Community Resilience in the Centre for Disaster Management and Public Safety. Professor Todd Lane is the Deputy Director of the ARC Centre for Excellence for Climate Extremes and Professor of Atmospheric Services and Meteorology at the School of Earth Sciences. Professor Marcia McKenzie is joining us from her current home in Saskatoon, Canada. She's incoming here as Deputy Director of the ARC, she's the leader of the SSHCR funded monitoring and evaluation of climate change education, and coming in as a professor here to the Melbourne Graduate School of Education. Welcome, Marcia. Associate Professor Malte Meinshausen is the founding director of the Climate and Energy College and co-director of the Energy Transition Hub. And last but not least, Dr. Erin O'Donnell is an early career fellow here at the Melbourne Law School and a member of the Birrarung Council, which is the voice of the Yarra River. So as you can see, we've got a formidable range of areas of research and expertise and insight, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what they have to say on this important topic. Okay, so to get things going, as I talked about in setting this session up, resilience is a pretty malleable notion, an engineering concept, a psychological trait. We talk about it in a community sense and also as a feature of individual character. We're going to be exploring what it looks like, what it means, try and sort of pin this maybe quite a elusive concept down in this discussion in all of the different ways it manifests in your work in terms of climate change. So to kick us off, in 90 seconds or thereabouts each of you, how does the word resonate in your field of work? And I'm going to turn it over to you. Maybe Lisa, would you like to go first?
Sure, thanks, Jo. Look, I'm a public health academic and my area of expertise is disaster resilience. So when I talk about resilience, I'm really talking about that interplay between the individual and whatever skills or traits that they may have and the social supports that they can draw on when they're dealing with adversity, the resources that they may have access to and the context that they're in. And of course, when we're thinking about disasters, which is one of the issues with climate change, what we see is that there's an impact on so many people. There's a mass impact. And so the supports, the friends, family, neighbours that people would normally draw on to help them to deal with that sort of trauma event, they're also affected. And the systems and services that people are needing to rely on tend to be overloaded. So when we think about resilience in the context of a mass emergency event, we see that people's capacity to adapt is really complicated. And the impacts are amplified by the fact that it's affecting everybody else as well. So the resilience is about that interaction and it's constantly changing.
Thanks, Lisa. Todd.
Okay, so I'm a physical scientist and we look at the physical science behind climate extremes. And I think what we recognise is that the community doesn't experience climate change as a change in the mean global temperature. The community experiences climate change as a change in the weather. It might be a change in storms or a change in heat waves, a change in bushfire weather. Right? And so it breaks down to a problem that, in addition to a climate change problem, it's very similar to a standard meteorological problem or a weather forecasting problem. And that's quite fitting to talk about this today because it's actually World Meteorological Day. And I'm sure everyone already knew that. So in terms of being prepared for extreme weather events, we sometimes talk about being what's called weather ready. Right? And what weather ready means is being able to prepare for an event, predict an event, and then respond to an event. And so you can think about that, an individual in terms of being weather ready for a bushfire. Individuals have their bushfire action plans. The prediction comes from emergency services or Bureau of Meteorology. And the response is an individual response, which might be to evacuate and or enact your bushfire plan, but there's also a response that comes from emergency services. And so you can expand that idea about being weather ready or being resilient to weather events to all kinds of climate extremes on longer timescales, where that preparation might be through policy frameworks, that prediction comes from our climate models, and the response is our adaptation, hopefully before that event actually occurs.
I guess big on Todd on World Meteorological Day, we are also getting a very live real-world update on our capacity to respond to extreme weather events in what's occurring right now through New South Wales and Queensland, and I guess we're going to see how well people have planned in our services, and from the individual level to the policy level, how those responses look, and understanding how critical they obviously are. I might throw here to Marcia.
Sure. Thanks, Joe. So in terms of how the word resilience resonates in my field of work, I think my response depends on how we define resiliency. The term colloquially can connote a focus on adaptation to the effects of climate change versus an emphasis also on mitigation or reduction of future impacts, as I think was suggested in the last panel. And in education, the field that I work in mainly, the term is often used to refer to individual psychological resiliency in the face of challenges. In other words, the changes or challenges have happened, and how do we best cope with them to continue on. However, I think we all want for upcoming generations for them to have more than to be, have to be continually coping or be resilient in this sense of the word to ever worsening climate change. We want our children and future generations to be able to thrive. And for that reason, a focus on climate mitigation, on keeping climate change at levels where humans can continue to thrive on the planet, is also essential. We both need to prepare ourselves the best we can to increasing fires, flooding, and other effects of climate change. And our approach to climate resiliency needs at least as significantly, I think, to be about catalyzing reductions in emissions quickly. So climate change education and communication have roles to play in both these respects of adaptation and mitigation of climate change, and particularly have potential as underutilized tools to enable the social and political will for climate action. And I'll say more about this as we go on.
Okay, thanks, Marcia. Malte, would you like to jump in here?
Yes, thank you. And since you framed resilience a little bit of, are we able to support our kids with being resilient against all the stresses in the school, for example, or if we look at resilience in the sense of, is it water that runs off the duck's back in terms of climate change impacts and we can easily cope with it, we should not kid ourselves. Climate change that is upon us, even with the strong mitigation scenarios, if we see 1.5 or 2 degrees temperature rise, we throw the Earth back 1 million years. It hasn't been there. And so there are lots of surprises in the pipeline, and some of them we can't predict. Certainly, many of those our ecosystems are just not adapted to. And so not only us, but also the ecosystems, and then in return, us again will suffer from that. But so I think that general notion is important, that resilience might, you ask how it sounds to us, and it sounds to me a little bit too positive. We have a lot of adaptation limits, but stepping back, I think the university, and that's why this launch of the Melbourne Climate Futures Initiative is so great, can still support resilience of the society in lots of ways. And I think the 3 main ways are there: data, and as Todd mentioned, the forecasting of weather events and really having probabilistic data of what is the climate change that is upon us. And I think that's crucially important, not only for business in the TCFD context, but for society as a whole to make the decisions which global warming level we want to go to. Then the second one is resilience, largely, even if we are not being able to adapt to some climate change, and it's rather a recovery after the loss and damage event, comes also, that might sound a bit conservative, but comes from economic strength. And there it's really surprising how Australia and the federal government in particular managed to not avoid any opportunity to really throw opportunities out, which lie on the plate here specifically for Australia. Australia could be building such a success stories of economic growth and jobs if it were to harness renewable energies, etc., and thereby build economic strength that allows us to be then hopefully adaptive and resilient to future climate change. And that also leads me to the third point is resilience is also needed in the policy realm. And we need to implement policies, particularly here in Australia, where like international colleagues look at us and we are just a policy laboratory. We throw up a climate policy and a few years later we tear it down. And so that robustness of policy is very important in terms of if we want to build resilience. And for that, it needs the social cohesion, it needs the joining vision. And that's, again, here the task for the federal policymakers to create that vision. And one of the main visions that everybody, not across the political aisle, should be able to subscribe to is what Vosgano also in the last session pointed out, is that energy superpower story for Australia, because that creates jobs, that builds economic resilience in a way. Still, coming back to my first point, we have to be aware that we can't just adapt our way out of it. The best adaptation is still mitigation, because we want to avoid the horrific impacts, but we can do everything with data, with economic strength, as with social cohesion and climate justice in our adaptation options and mitigation options to hopefully build a better future.
Thanks, Malte. As you were speaking, what you say about, policy and collective action, it's really resonating, because my bedtime reading at the moment is Michael Mann's book, which obviously its kind of central theme is that individual action and is all very well and good, but unless we move collectively, unless we move policy, we are not going to get anything like the kind of traction that we need for things to change in the way they need to change. So hopefully, that policy collective action is really where we're throwing a lot of our discussion here today. Okay, Erin, sorry, last but not least, what would you like to contribute here at this in kicking things off?
Thank you, and thank you everyone. That was a really interesting overview from lots of different perspectives. So I'm just going to start, I think, with 3 points from my sphere of work. The first point I'd like to make is that when we think about resilience, we need to be thinking in terms of social ecological systems and recognising the interdependency between ecosystems and people. And that interdependency is something which has not been a big factor in the way that Euro-Western systems have governed ecosystems, natural systems, like water, for instance, where I do a lot of my work. But here in Australia, we could be asking people who know what it is like to live on country that is thriving and flourishing through sea level rises, through climate shifts that many modern societies don't have any kind of living memory of. And that's Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islanders here in Australia. They know their laws, their cultural protocols reflect what it is to persist and to thrive through hugely varying systems. Now, we just heard that 1.5 to 2 degrees might set us back 1 million years. Look, that's certainly a long time, but there's tremendous amounts to be learnt from the way that Aboriginal people have lived successfully in Australia for 65,000 years and more. So I think one of the questions we need to be asking ourselves when we think about resilience is whose voices are being heard, who is defining what resilience is, and what kind of future are we actually being resilient for? The other couple of points I'd just like to briefly flag is the idea of how resilience fits up against ideas of economic strength, for instance, and economic efficiency. So in the water space, again, where I spend a lot of my time, one of the drivers there for policy is around efficient water use, moving water to its highest value use. And there's lots that can be gained from doing that. But one of the things it does do is it can start to take out flexibility in the system. So if everybody's using their water for their maximum value, then as soon as there's not enough water to go around, somebody's going to get hit really hard because they simply don't have enough water, and the water has a really high value. So when we think about resilience, we need to be thinking about how do we build in a buffer to the system? How do we leave water in the river? How do we protect ecosystems so that they have the capacity to respond during times of change? One of the really exciting tools that has begun to emerge in river management around the world is the recognition of rivers as living beings. And that's starting to transform our very relationship with rivers and start to, again, shift the mindset and the framing that we bring to these questions of resilience and scarcity and change, and moving us away from this extractive mindset of how do we get as much as we can from the ecosystems around us, and instead starting to position us into a relationship with the river where we recognise our interdependence and our mutual obligations, and that we start to ask questions around what do we want for ourselves and for the river? How do we get there with the river? And those kinds of questions, I think, can be really powerful in terms of shaping resilience and shaping the kind of futures that we actually want.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Erin. I was thinking as you spoke, researching stories over the years into the Murray-Darling system, and I think the only clarity I ever got, the lesson that I heard was that everyone upstream is a thief and everyone downstream is a liar. And I'm thinking, I guess the lesson of what you're saying is that we need to be actually listening to the river itself, and then we might come to some truth. Okay, now I'm going to change arrangements here just a little bit. We've got through our opening kind of ambit, and we would really like this to be a conversation between this panel. So as we talk, I'm going to maybe hang back a little, not jump straight into the silences, so that you get an opportunity to talk to one another. But in this imperfect sort of Zoom land world that we've all gotten fairly good at, just, wave or interrupt. And I'm sure our broad audience will forgive us for that sort of interaction. It's become part of our normal world. So as I said, we're not going to sort of move one by one in answering to each of the questions that we'll run through now. But our first sort of general question, I guess I wanted to put to the floor, again, talking about building resilience in our kids, in our systems, in our infrastructure. I'm just trying to get my head around what it actually looks like and feels like. So again, I'm wondering what kinds of strategies and actions we enlist, and what do we need to know to be climate resilience, and how we apply that knowledge. Does anybody want to help me kind of understand some of that application of that knowledge, what it looks like?
I can jump in just to start off, Joe. There's just lots of different things I think that are sitting in that conversation. So let me think. While we have to absolutely focus on mitigation actions, we do have to live with the world as it's changing now. So, one of the things that we do need to be talking about is much better disaster resilience education within schools and within communities, so people know how to prepare for, respond to, and recover from major weather events. The other thing is to think not just about physical safety in the world that we're living in, but thinking about the mental health relationship we have with the environment. I mean, our research has shown that people who have a connection to the natural environment mourn damage to the environment, but also recover so much better in terms of mental health and well-being in the aftermath of, in the years after there's been a major disaster event. And of course, that positive relationship we have with the environment is really being affected by this growing eco-anxiety. So how does that affect our sense of hope that things will improve after a major event? And how does it affect our sense that we can change what is happening to the natural environment? So I would suggest that if we're talking about preparing, how do we build climate resilience, we need to be thinking about the mental health element and our relationship with the natural environment, because, at the risk of stating the absolute obvious, it's a nature-led recovery that we're looking at. And it's that the physical and mental health impacts that are part of that.
I can maybe jump in next if you want to. What I want to speak to, I think, relates to what Elisa's just been saying. So in terms of what education and communication can bring to this, that the scale of climate action that is needed, really we need to get more of the public on board to understand the urgency to take adaptation or mitigation efforts and to demand and facilitate legislative and policy change. And we found, and this relates to what Lisa was saying, that a main barrier to the public getting on board is not a lack of, knowledge or cognitive understanding of the climate science, or even a lack of awareness of the impacts of climate change. Instead, is other factors that kind of get in the way of that knowledge being able to lead to support for action. And so factors such as political ideology and affiliation, as well as other forms of community identification, have been found to be key to belief in climate change in places where we're still struggling like that with that. Say, I know that is still a factor in some locations in Australia and in the US and in Canada as well, right around where I am. As well as, for folks to move past belief to have support for taking action. This has also been borne out in the audience segmentation studies, including in Australia. We're kind of dividing up the population into different segments that take different perspectives and orientations to climate change. So there's several key aspects of addressing this barrier, so it's not lack of information, it's kind of our identifications that cause us to not mobilize. And so how do we deal with that? And so there's in literature in areas such as sociology of climate change denial or cultural cognition, climate change communication, and so on, pointing out key components such as the framing of climate change and the need to frame it in language and priorities that are already important to people, whether that's different communities or religious communities, business communities, other types of identification groups. And then another key consideration is how we tackle the forms of denial for those people who do believe in climate change. And this comes to what Lisa was speaking to, but just want life to go back to normal, to not face the prospect of an uninhabitable future planet, and so try not to think about it all, to sort of stave off the sense of loss and grief, and what does it mean for my children or my grandchildren to not be looking down the road at a habitable planet? How do we cope with that? So responding to this requires in fact, how do we target that? We have to help people turn towards the grief, or ourselves kind of turn towards that loss, and activating sentiments of hope rather than despair through forms of participation in action and support for action. So, in short, we're much better positioned for the rapid political mobilization that's needed within short timeframes if more communities turn towards rather than away from climate change, and that this involves forms of social, emotional, and participatory knowledge and engagement rather than just more information.
Okay.
And in addition to these very important knowledge aspects to how we deal and build with resilience, maybe I have here a completely different angle, which is, and I talked about the federal government, but let's talk about business for a second. I think one thing that 2021 will see in relation to the question, what kind of data, what information do we need to build resilience in relation to the business sector, is clearly centered around the task force for climate-related financial disclosures. And there we have the three aspects, and again, our university can contribute so much to it. The three aspects are the physical climate risks, and what are the tropical cyclones that are hitting Australian shores? Where do they land? Which areas they're going to affect? How do their intensities change? Do their frequencies drop, etc.? The river floods, the droughts, etc. And there we have fantastic researchers also, some postdocs now, Mandy Freud or Natasha Ballas, who put the droughts in the Australian in Australia into the historical context, so that we have better ability to project them. And I think that is really vital information that we as university can contribute to the resilience. And then the second aspect really being the energy transition and the opportunities. And I think the next segment goes into it a bit more. And then the third aspect being the liabilities, of which Jackie Peel as a worldwide expert on. But I think in terms of business, we also have to confess that we are just at the beginning of this journey of what exact data is most useful in a standardized setting so that every boardroom in Australia can make that information actionable on where to expand, how to climate proof their assets, etc., or how to have a better ability to recover after the next climate disaster.
I guess I'd quite like to build on what Malte was just saying. I think we'd all really like policy that's informed by science, and a business response and a community response that's informed by science. And I guess Malte just touched on this aspect of having uniform information going to the boardrooms, but we also need to recognise that the response is sector specific, and we have different sectors that are sensitive to climate in very different ways. And you can think of agriculture as what I would call a super climate sensitive sector, where they're affected by seasonal rainfall, they're affected by heat extremes, they're affected by short-term rainfall events like floods. And so their response has to be really quite complex to respond for all of those changes in the climate system. But also, I think the biggest challenge here is dealing with uncertainty and communication of that uncertainty around what the climate future looks like has been a challenge for climate science and meteorology and many fields for a long time, because humans don't understand uncertainty very well and don't deal well with uncertainty or make decisions around uncertainty very well. And then you think about, well, the different climate extremes, for example, or the different climate patterns that might change. And some of those we have more certainty about than others, right? So if you were to list them, you'd say, well, we know a lot more about heat extremes and how heat extremes are going to change with climate. Rainfall, we know something about how rainfall is going to change, but there's still a large amount of uncertainty around the patterns of seasonal rainfall change. And then we have shorter duration rainfall events as well, which we in some ways have more confidence in terms of their intensity, but not necessarily their frequency. And then there's others like hail, where we could just put our hand on our heart and say, we actually don't really know what's going to happen around hail events. And so dealing with that uncertainty, but also providing information for those sectors that need it is a real challenge. And so we need to try and work with them and work collaboratively to work out how best to deal with that uncertainty, but still have science informing their decision making.
Thanks, Todd. Drilling down a little bit further, I'm wondering what you've observed in your work, whether you've seen sort of examples of climate resilience being constructed or nurtured. So we can be talking about physical infrastructure or psychological adaptation or change or interventions. Again, if any of you'd like to respond to that.
Oh, well, I can jump in if I'll have an example from close to home on this. Perhaps like others, I'm a parent, and my daughter came home a few years ago from school in tears, in a sequence of days, having heard about the 2018 Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, which came out giving us, at that time around 12 years remaining to take significant action. And that report also helped spur the spread of the school climate strikes at that time, which my daughter then joined, becoming active, and noticeably was decreased her levels of sadness and hopelessness in the front of climate change. And the next year, her class presented to their teachers in order to be able to attend the school climate strikes, which are still ongoing the next year, as part of school. And permission was given by the school, but then the broader school division shut down the event of classes attending the day before the citywide climate strike. So, which was very disappointing to the students and a real loss of a sense of where are leaders in dealing with this issue, where are school leaders. And so a positive outcome of the backlash to this decision was that the division approached us about providing support for climate change education in the division, which resulted in school division climate change education training for all the teachers, signing of a MOU, and continued work with the division on governance and facilities changes as well to further climate action. So I think this is, just one specific example of how in this case, youth action had ripple effects and shifting structures, getting leadership attention through their roles as students. And you see, a similar type of thing in the university sector with student-led divestment campaigns, which are active across many countries, including Canada. It's another example.
I'd just like to, pick up on a few threads of that. In the work that I do with the Bureau and Council, we've been developing new ways of thinking about environmental net gain, and specifically bicultural ways of thinking about net gain and the benefits that come from working on country and caring for country. So we've been working with Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people, and they have a NARIP team, a landscape management team. And for the individual members of that team, being able to go out on country and care for it, to have that as their job, to go out and connect with country and be with country and look after country, has tremendous mental and spiritual benefits that flow from that. And in conversation with this team, they talk about that really beautifully and eloquently as a profound and important connection to place, and also as a way of giving effect to their responsibilities to care for country. And I think the more that non-Indigenous Australia can learn from that kind of connection to country and the connection between people and place, the better we are going to be positioned to respond to these kinds of extraordinary changes and catastrophes. And I think you can even see some of that coming through in the past 12 months. So when Melbourne was under lockdown, most people could only travel 5 kilometres from home for 1 hour a day. And so we went predominantly to the green spaces that we could find, and those are along our creeks and rivers. And so again, there was that extraordinary recognition of where you live and how it connects into the natural environment, and that the balm that brought people in this really difficult time was powerful and important. And again, I think it provides that kind of foundation for climate resilience, because it gives you that connection and that relationship, so you don't have to get stuck in those wells of despair and hopelessness, and you can see a way to connect what you value in your local environment to these broader realms. We can see it playing out really powerfully internationally as well. So in Colombia, for instance, which was one of the first countries to recognise a river as a legal person, the subject of rights, they've recently recognised part of the Amazon rainforest as the subject of rights as well. And the reason they did that was because of a youth coalition that got together to say, these are our rights, our futures that are being threatened and squandered by climate change. And one of the ways that we need to mitigate and protect both ourselves and those coming after us is to protect the interests of the Amazon rainforest as a major climate change mitigation. Although there's some really devastating data coming out now to suggest that the health of the Amazon is at a tipping point. But that was a really compelling legal argument to say our connection to each other, to ourselves, and to the forest is so profound that actually we need to recognise the forest itself as having legal rights to provide us with that kind of connection into the future.
Thanks, Erin. Because I'm aware that we're really this conversation is advancing beautifully, and we're getting through a lot of time though very quickly. And so I just think we also need to recognise that when we talk about climate change inside a framing of resilience, and that does generally lend, Malte mentioned it before, a kind of a positive spin to it. And as a reporter who has done a lot of work particularly in Papua New Guinea over the last 15 years, and one way or other, pretty much every story I'm looking at, urbanisation and disease spread, if you dig into them, there is a climate factor often at play in behind these kind of movements of populations or disease and malnutrition issues. And I was thinking about, there was a study published in Nature Geoscience just a couple of weeks ago, which basically argued if we don't hold warming to 1.5 degrees, conditions in the tropics will approach the limits of human livability, that, you know, there is a point at which the human body simply can't cope. So I'm just think we need to talk about the limitations of resilience, the cost of resilience, and how accessible that is to some communities. How realistic is the ambition of resilience inside the kind of conditions that we're creating?
I make a first initial remark here. I think the studies that are mapping out the areas of the world that are becoming inhabitable, it is interesting, it is nice, but in a way, we humans are incredibly adaptive to that kind of thing. And there are, in the Dubai oil states, there are people living with big fat air conditioners all around indoors. And so we are able as humans to, withdraw ourselves a little bit from the natural environment that is out there. I think so. Even though it's good to look into those, the key crucial climate changes comes from, for example, ecosystems not having refrigerators to withdraw themselves. For example, the Great Barrier Reef. And the Great Barrier Reef, even if we think about all possible adaptation options, we are going to lose it. We are going to lose the coral reef's diversity, and that is another limitation to resilience. Either in the coral triangle communities that are dependent on the coral reefs for their fishing, there will be a major change. Yes, some corals will survive, but it will be a much less diverse ecosystem, etc. So I think the main driver for us being impacted is really via the ecosystems that have been adapted to climate change over the last 2,000 and 10,000 years to a particular setting, and we now propel them out into spaces that they haven't seen before, and therefore we see the mass coral bleaching, and for example the coral reef, we are losing it. So yeah, that's just one point on the nature geoscience study that you mentioned there.
I think that's an important point that Malte makes, is that the rate of warming here is what's important, because it's occurring faster than those ecosystems can adjust and evolve. Right? And so fisheries is a great example of one where it's going to be strongly affected by climate change, and it's something that we as humans rely on as well for feeding us and an important industry, including tourism as well. I guess I would suggest that there are aspects of us as humans that aren't particularly resilient already to many of these climate extremes. And you think about, even in Australia, we're a wealthy, developed country, and when we have heat extremes, we have sometimes hundreds of excess deaths in our cities. Right? So if you go back 10 years to Black Saturday, where we had these devastating bushfires, there are actually more people who died in the heat wave before Black Saturday than actually died in those fires. Right? And so this is a lack of resilience that we have as a community, and we're a very wealthy country with lots of infrastructure, and really we shouldn't be seeing those kind of deaths during a heat event. And if you go to other parts of the world, sometimes those numbers during heat events are thousands or tens of thousands for the Russian heat wave or the European heat wave recently. So I think that there is this limit to resilience, and we're already pushing that limit already. And I don't think we're really resilient to everything in our current climate.
Lisa?
Thanks, Jo. Yeah, we're actually releasing our 10 Years Beyond Bushfires report next week, which is following on from the Black Saturday bushfires. So just picking up on Todd's comment. And look, what we learned from that, and the benefit, if I can call it that, of examining what happens after an extreme event like that, is that it shows us how the impacts affect every aspect of our lives. So it's not just the hazard event. You see a loss of housing, you see loss of jobs, you see relationship breakdown, you see financial hardship, these multiple impacts. And so while people are extraordinarily resilient, it's absolutely true, there's a limit. And what we need to be mindful of with climate change is that we are likely to see these breakdowns across the many different sectors of our lives. And that is what will undermine resilience before we get to a point that we can't tolerate the temperatures. So yeah, I'll leave it at that.
We've got about 5 minutes left before we go to our audience for some questions. Did somebody else want to dive in here before we move to our next one?
I was just going to make a quick comment. I think there's an inherent question in the nature of resilience and what it means in terms of it representing a kind of a stable state. And I think one of the big limits to resilience is, what is it about this particular stable state that makes it so desirable? And I think as white, wealthy people, it's often easy to look at this and go, well, of course this is desirable. But here in Australia right now, there are communities in New South Wales that struggle to get clean drinking water because of blue-green algal blooms. There are Aboriginal communities in Northern Territory where their drinking water supplies are contaminated with arsenic and uranium, and somehow it's nobody's responsibility to fix those. So I think there is an inherent question here about, is resilience a way of kind of deifying the current situation and seeing it as something that is inherently good? If you speak to Indigenous peoples almost anywhere around the world, in the context of the Anthropocene and the kind of global catastrophes, and white people are saying, but what will happen? And our whole world is crashing down around us. And Indigenous people say, well, that happened to us 200 years ago, 300 years ago, 400 years ago. So on the one hand, it's an extraordinary tale of resilience and persistence, but on the other, it's a reminder to think about what it is that we're actually valuing in this resilience conversation.
I'm just wondering whether, is there a question that when we talk about climate resilience, whether we risk being seen to be sort of putting up the white flag, in a sense of resigning ourselves to finding ways to live inside this superheated, extreme, violent future, and leaving other living creatures, living beings to their fate along the way? Are we resigning ourselves to the inevitable, putting up the white flag? Is this another deflection? Rather than fighting like fury to take action to mitigate the pace and the extent of climate impacts?
I can maybe chip in. I was in the climate negotiations from about the year 2000, and I remember very vividly that I myself kind of spewed at the notion of now adaptation should come into the negotiation text, because I saw it just as this is capitulation. We have to focus all hands on mitigation. And then over the years, of course, it shifted. The more you look at adaptation, the more you look at the climate impacts, and the more you look at also the limits to adaptation, the more you realize absolutely we need focus on adaptation, but it also shows us how dearly needed the mitigation is. And I think we moved then a long way also in the mitigation sense from it, that now the resilience can be more than just the impact, the adaptation and the building resilience to impacts. It can be more the mainstreaming of climate science that is so important. And I think in terms of the mainstreaming, if we use our public resources wisely to build resilience, to do combine mitigation and other co-benefits. Let's just take the transport sector. Why is Australia not jumping on electric mobility, where we can tick off air pollution big time? We have economic benefits from it in the long term, etc. That is just perplexing why Australia doesn't choose the way. In terms of the in terms of the recovery package after COVID, one other huge disaster that could show us a bit how we recover from these disasters and what public policy tools we take into their hand. If you look around the world, every other country uses that opportunity to you would say swap multiple flies with one clap or whatever, but the like Germany has more than 50% of its recovery packages green, has a it's in terms of green energy, etc. Finland and France, 50 45%. Even a country as backwards as Poland in terms of wanting to do climate mitigation and hugely dependent on coal has 30% of its recovery package related to green investments. And for Australia, 3 to 4% maybe. So again, that comes back to the point of Australia doesn't miss any opportunity to go wasted, to not to do the right thing. And it's so perplexing and so ironic because Australia would benefit the most from it, from a country that is so blessed with renewable energy resources, to really put us on a different path and thereby build resilience, do mitigation at the same time, etc. And so that mainstreaming of climate change and that thinking across all the political portfolios is so important.
Marcia?
Sure. And I see some comments in the chat with very different definitions of resilience coming up, which was what I wanted to speak to in terms of whether, the question of whether all this talk of resilience being a potential distraction. And one of the things that worries me about focusing overly on the use of that term in a response to climate change is that it can be one of those terms like sustainability or sustainable development that can mean so many different things to different people, which on one hand, a term like that can get things done because it engages people in a range of ways and can be less polarizing. But it also risks, I think, what's being done under that malleability can be inadequate to the task, in this case, addressing climate change on an urgent timescale. And the university where I've been for the past decade has had strong historical ties to resource sectors through endowed chairs, centers, and signature research areas, and so on, all of which, makes change when you want to make urgent, significant change, it makes that difficult. And I've been cross-appointed to an interdisciplinary school of environment and sustainability, as well as sitting on the core team developing the university's new sustainability plan. And I've seen some of the ways that terms like sustainability, the SDGs, and sometimes the term resilience as well can be comfortably taken on and promoted without resulting in much change in existing trajectories or priorities of a university or region. So I think that this question of terminology, which is partly how you could take up this question, you could take it up in different ways, as Malte has as well, in terms of talking about the importance of adaptation and mitigation. But in terms of what terminology we use to talk about, the importance of those different aspects, I think is an important question for a new initiative such as this, and that the type of language used can frame the types of climate futures that are conceptualized, prioritized, funded, and so on.
Thanks, Marcia. Lisa?
I totally agree that the term resilience is contested and it's useful because we all kind of understand it, but it's problematic because we have different uses of the term and people react to it sometimes. There may be benefit in adopting a new term. I quite like transilience. It could be annoying because it sounds a little bit, slogany, but it does mean a more deliberate moving forward into a changed space. And I think that that's helpful because there is an element with resilience of the sense that we're trying to go back or restore what we had, and we're in a changed world. And part of that notion of moving forward and recognizing things have changed is the need for social mobilization. And we do know there's some evidence that when you see sort of solidarity and people moving together to address severe adversity, you have better outcomes than when people are trying to protect their own interests. And so this notion of collective action is really important here. And that's not to shift responsibility away from governments. It's about sharing responsibility and just recognizing something has to be happening on every level. And if we are working together for a collective outcome that addresses inequity, we will all fare better than when we're trying to protect our own little patch. And I think, the actions of the Australian government reflect that.
I'm going to have to draw a line here because I'm sure that some of our panellists might also want to visit this, but we're eating into some of our audience question time. We've got about 15 minutes left. So let me throw to the audience, and maybe there'll be an opportunity to come back to some of these themes if there's something that you really want to get off your chest before we finish off. So the first question that I'm getting from the audience is this one. Educating our community to tackle climate change and build resilience is a massive undertaking. What does the panel think are some of the key changes needed to do this?
And to do this being to educate the public on this?
I think it's, yes.
Okay.
Educating our community to tackle climate change and build resilience is a massive, yes, it's about the education process. So it's entirely in your ballpark.
Yeah. And I also saw a comment in the chat about how education, it seems like such a long-term plan. We need action now. But David Suzuki, who's a big Canadian environmentalist here, he said if he knew how long it would take us, he would have started, instead of focus on science, he would have started on education 30 years ago. And education, since the original Climate Change Convention of the UN, education and communication are in there, and again in the Paris Agreement. So I think countries have made this commitment and recognition that if we just wait for, we have the science and the technology that we need to address climate change, but what we don't have is a social and political will. So if we say well, education is too long a path, and we don't mobilize people, we might be waiting forever to be able to use our, the ways that we can mitigate climate change. In terms of how we do it, I have, I guess, two points I'll just briefly say. One that we focus on in our research is the importance of, what's called in education kind of a whole institution, or the K-12 level whole school approach. So students like, my daughter at the university, they don't necessarily want more curriculum on this. They know climate change is an issue in a lot of cases. Where they want to see is their leadership, the infrastructure also addressing this. So, it's going beyond just what happens in the classroom, though that's important, but also looking at overall governance level, and then flow through to on the operations side, the footprint of educational institutions, as well as engagements and partnerships with communities. So that kind of whole institution approach to education is really central. And then another, piece that I've already touched on, but is just the need to go beyond the, more knowledge of the science of climate change, which is still how a lot of education and communication around climate change are done, is just, tell people how it works, how we, why we get climate change from emissions, instead of engaging with the kind of social emotional aspects, as well as opportunities for action, which then, really enable people to feel more active and hopeful. So I'll just stop there. I'm sure other people have things they want to add.
Thanks, Marcia.
I just want to add briefly to that. In extending education beyond the science, I think there's also a role for education to play in educating all of us about how to hold people to account for commitments in this space, how to use the laws that we have already more effectively. So for instance, there are laws that require best available science to be used, and yet many policymakers are not actually applying that best available science. And we seem to let them get away with that. So I think there's education on multiple levels. There's an education about what we should be able to expect from our policymakers and our decision makers, and an education about the tools that are available to us to hold them to account and to enforce that.
If I can just add one more comment, I think that's great. And this new partnership that we have, the $4 million project with University of Melbourne is now a partner on, is focused on at the policy level and at the intergovernmental level, in trying to hold countries to account for their commitments in this area. And, and that flows down to policymakers at different levels.
I'm going to push on to the next question from our audience, and I think it's directed to you, Lisa. Our climate responsibilities must acknowledge the complexities and inequities of the climate crisis. Lisa, you mentioned that we sometimes focus too much on technocratic solutions to addressing the needs of vulnerable communities. What are the alternatives to that, is the question from someone in the audience.
Can you repeat that? I'm not sure if I
So
got
it's
that.
really that you mentioned that sometimes we focus too much on technocratic solutions in addressing the needs of vulnerable communities. And so I guess this person's wondering, what are the alternatives, I guess, to technological technocratic responses.
Okay.
And any of the other panelists are welcome to dive in here.
Sure. Look, I don't think there's any simple answers. I think whatever we consider involves complexity and involves multiple strategies across multiple settings, and engaging people in developing solutions. So I'm not saying one or the other. I'm saying we need to be mindful of the fact that people are being affected in different ways, and that's not always taken into account in the strategies that are developed.
Does anyone else want to dive in on that?
I could just briefly say that I think on the last panel was raised the good point, and I think Erin touched on this as well, just the importance of taking leadership from the vulnerable communities, from those that are, whether it's different communities within a country or other countries that are most affected by climate change and often least responsible, but that the amazing leadership that's being done by different countries. And I know in Canada, a lot of amazing projects and organizations such as led by Indigenous communities, such as Indigenous Climate Action is a fantastic organization. So I'll just add that briefly.
Yes, what a radical idea to actually listen to the people at the front line about what they want to do and what they're already doing, all of the initiatives that they've got underway. The third question from our audience picks up on something that Erin mentioned about the kind of international momentum to give legal rights to natural resources. What do we need to do in Australia, the audience member asks, to ensure that those without power are heard when we're considering resilience needs? For example, both children and the rights of nature. How do we ensure that they're brought into this discussion?
So, look, yeah, that's a really good question. It's a question that's really difficult, again, to solve. I think one of the ways that we can do that is to acknowledge that although they may lack a physical voice, say in the example of a river or a mountain or a forest, we can create institutional arrangements that enable them to have that voice. So, for instance, the Birrarung Council is the voice of the Birrarung, the Yarra River, and it includes representatives from the traditional owners, Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung, and our job is to be that voice, to speak for the river. And the way that we've kind of figured out how to do that is to work with the community vision. So there is a community vision for the next 50 years for the Yarra, which was created by all of the communities that live along and in the catchment of the Yarra and that love the river, and explicitly pairing that with the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung ancient spirit and law of the Yarra. And so together, these documents give us a little bit of a blueprint and a way of making sure that when we are speaking for the river, that we're grounding it in the relationship between people and the river. So I think that is a way forward. There's moves afoot in a number of different parts of Australia to try and bring forward the voiceless into these conversations through relationships with people. So the Barca Water Commission on the Barca-Darling and the Murray-Darling Basin is under development. Up in northwestern Western Australia, there's the Muttawarra-Fitzroy River Council. And so again, it's about bringing together all of the peoples that love and live with these rivers and saying, how do we make sure that rivers have a voice? One thing I would like to urge, though, as a note of caution in this is we need to question why a voice is so important. Because voices are most important in these kind of policy debates when it is a debate, when it is in fact a competition for a policy outcome. So if we instead focus on changing our policy spaces so that it's less about aggravating for what you want and competing for what you want, and much more about our mutual obligation and interdependence, and the obligation that the powerful owe the vulnerable to seek out and amplify their voices, then that changes the entire policy dynamic quite dramatically. And I think that's the kind of shift that I think we need to bring in voices of children, of people with disabilities who perhaps don't directly speak for themselves, of nature. I recognise that I'm running over a lot of those issues and I don't want to conflate any of them. They each have very specific needs and interests in the way that their voices are heard. But if we focus on interdependence and mutual obligation, then that can be a transformative way of thinking.
Can I chip in here on international legal frameworks and the voices of those impacted? I think one comment here from the audience by Ian Fry, internationally one of the most important voices on loss and damage and vulnerability, I think is a very crucial one. And that is, if we want to give some level of protection, or if we first want to acknowledge the issue of loss and damage, we have to have clear definitions. And it's absolutely vital in the international context that resilience is termed in response to human-induced climate change. And why is that so important, and why it is important not to blur the lines between just any kind of natural disaster? It's because for human-induced climate change, we have somebody who's responsible for it, and these are those countries who emitted lots of CO2 emissions in the past and who contributed to the current climate change. And so therefore, there is potentially a legal framework in which you can implement the polluters pay principle. If we have wishy-washy definitions of resilience, then that avenue is not given. And there are, of course, 100 other hurdles, and Ian Fry would be much better to speak to that. But it is interesting, again, in the international context, the burden sharing debate that has so much centered on mitigation is now shifting away from mitigation, because the smartest thing to do is also the good thing to do, which is renewable energy, zero emission technologies are becoming the cheapest. But on the adaptation front and the loss and damage front, there the burden sharing is still, that debate hasn't really fully picked up yet. And so there, those who emitted most in the past should be responsible for the damage that is caused, and for those who face loss and damage is crucial. And it comes down to not only giving rivers a legal right as a person, it is also just being very clear in the legal definition of resilience, and then further international frameworks can
And the term natural disasters is also contested now for similar reasons, in the sense that if you look at the bushfires, arguably there's a climate change element that drives the frequency and severity of the bushfires, but there's also arsonists that might be involved. There's also technology that might be involved, because overhead wires have sparked. So I think that the conversation about the overlap between natural disasters and climate change is progressing.
I just wanted to, in fact, I think we'll need to move to our kind of final question. We've got, a lot of questions coming in from the audience, but our time, I'm very aware, is sort of quickly evaporating. And I do think it's important to sort of at least, wind up with some discussion, I guess, of, this thing that's been mentioned several times across this conversation and is inevitably mentioned in pretty much every serious conversation about where we are on the climate crisis, which is the one of hope, and what that means. And for my 2 bobs worth, I keep coming back to that Rebecca Solnit line around hope, which is that hope is not the lottery ticket that you clutch and hold on the sofa. Hope is the axe with which you break down the door in an emergency. So I'm really quite taken to weaponized hope at this point in the discussion. But I'd really like to know at this, as we wind up this discussion, that big, meaty, malleable word hope, tell us what's the one thing that you hope we might and can be doing as a community right now.
Oops, I was muted. I can start on this. I think you mentioned hope, and what gives me hope at the moment is for those people who are really engaged in this concept of climate action and interested in climate change and coming up with a solution. And more often than not, they are the younger generation. And so we're seeing this younger generation of people come through our schools and our universities. And so how to weaponise them, and to use your term, Joe, is to actually is to train them. We need people who are trained not only in the scientific aspects of climate science, but also those solutions and those multidisciplinary aspects on how to bring solutions and adaptations to our country and to our world. And I think that's where over the coming years we're going to give this advanced training to people who really are going to use it in this in really this recovery over the coming decades.
Thanks, Todd.
In my field, hope is inextricably linked with a sense of self and collective efficacy, which in itself is linked with connectedness. And so I would be advocating for building that connectedness to local place, but also beyond our own local social networks to others who are committed to change, because it's what we can achieve together that will give us that sense of hope going forward.
Thanks, Lisa. I'm going to move the way that I see you on my screen. Malte.
Yeah, I think maybe weaponizing hope, yes. But both hope and resilience sound a little bit to me like we are on the defensive side. And I think the vision and that gives us the energy to go ahead and march ahead in a direction that we can all subscribe to. I think it's important. I don't have the right English word here, but I think for that, yeah, considering climate resilience, but considering the immense opportunity that come for Australia, as discussed in the previous panel discussion, that come with a net zero world, we are so much better off than almost any other place in the world. And if we build the vision across the community that we can have better jobs, even for people who don't care about weather and climate at all, they would subscribe to something where we have being a zero emissions powerhouse and can give the means and the legal status, etc., to not only people here in Australia, but also to our Pacific neighbors, to and be a good global citizen as a side product. I think that would be a vision that should activate us. And I think that is the important part, being active and pursuing the vision rather than being thinking about the defensive part, because there are going to be surprises along the way where we can't adapt to.
Thank you. Erin?
So I think what I hope for is that we can centre justice in this conversation about climate change and resilience and what does the future look like. I think justice is hope activated. It is hope given form. It is the recognition that not everybody is being heard right now, that the status quo is not something that we necessarily want to ring fence as the stable point to guide the future. John Barnett said this morning in the first panel that what Australia can learn from the Pacific Island experience of responding to climate change is courage, honesty, and leadership. And I think those traits are things that we should be expecting much more from ourselves, from our political leaders, from everyone. And I think if we genuinely centre justice, if we engage with questions of who is being heard, who has agency in these conversations, who has power, who's actually making these kinds of decisions, then that is a path forward that is genuinely transformative and long-term sustainable and hopeful.
Thanks, Erin. And Marcia, finally.
Sure. Maybe to add, I agree with all my colleagues' points, and maybe to add another angle that we haven't touched on is in terms of the COVID pandemic. And this came up in the panel this morning. I think it was Kate Dooley that mentioned the links between, habitat changes due to deforestation and species moving, but, also are being linked to climate change as well, in terms of some of the things that have got different species on the move and a loss of habitat that are leading to the overlap in species and the transfer of disease, and that, predictions that, like Anthony Fauci said, we can expect sort of this new era of pandemics. This is only just the beginning. So I think, one hopeful aspect of that is, can we take this as another kind of wake-up call if we haven't had enough already through the bushfires and all the other things that are going on? This last year can be another form of wake-up call that we've got to start interacting differently with our ecosystems, with the global ecosystems, so that we not only don't experience the other climate impacts that we're already experiencing, but also the related losses of and changes to biodiversity that are linked to growing frequency and severity of pandemics. So want to take that as a hope, maybe, but it sounds ominous.
Thanks so much, Marcia. And we'll have to bring things to a close there. And just a big thank you to everyone on the panel for contributing your thoughts and your insights and aspects of your research to this discussion. The next session in this a very full day of events is very much focused on the next generation of practitioners, professionals, researchers, academics. And it's really, we're hoping it's going to be a very lively and honest session about building your career in a climate-related discipline. It's hosted by Nate Byrne, weather presenter on ABC Breakfast, and a man who knows a thing or two about varied career paths. The Melbourne Climate Futures, just to remind you, is a brand new initiative from the University of Melbourne. This discussion is one of 4 sessions that are being held today. If you missed one and you want to catch it up, you can find the others from tomorrow will be available on the University of Melbourne's YouTube channel. And if you want any more information on the initiative and on upcoming events, please visit us at research.unimelb.edu.au. And we also have a great piece on the university's news channel Pursuit, and you can read this on pursuit.unimelb.edu.au or Google Pursuit and Melbourne Climate Futures, and I'm sure you'll find it. Thanks very much to everybody, and we'll call that a wrap. Thank you.
Thanks.